Okay, here we go with the Constitution of the United States of America, which is really what has made us who we are. But of course, it didn't start out that way. There was a long history in the United States before we became the United States of America. And part of that you get from your U.S. history courses, which we really don't have time to repeat everything here. But one of the things we do want to talk about, of course, is the Declaration of Independence. Like I say, and a lot of things that happened before that. We'll let your U.S. history courses cover those. I will say this. Thomas Paine, he wrote a pamphlet entitled Common Sense, and it's been called the most influential pamphlet ever written. And also what has been said of that, it fired independence. This fire of independence was in the air. And so when the revolt came, when you have the shot at Lexington and Concord, and you get this conflict between the colonists and Mother England, and then Mother England strikes back, or as I like to say, the Empire strikes back. You get this movement for independence. And so on June 7th, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, he adopted a resolution in the Continental Congress, or he proposed a resolution that says the colonies are of right. These united colonies are of right and ought to be free. So that resolution was adopted on July 2nd, 1776, and a couple of days later, you have this document produced by Thomas Jefferson. There was 3 people assigned to write it, but it was Thomas Jefferson who actually wrote it. It's one of those documents that have had a monumental impact, not only in our country but throughout the world. John Adams, he did say this, and John Adams was one of those men that was instrumental in the revolution. He said the real revolution occurred in the hearts and minds of the people in the decade before independence. So before even Thomas Jefferson writes this Declaration of Independence, it had already occurred. The Declaration had already occurred. It occurred in the only place that it mattered, and it occurred in the hearts and minds of the people. So when they actually make the break, they're prepared to go through with what they believe in their heart. So in this Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson writes, he invokes natural rights. In other words, we have these rights because of nature or nature's God. And they're ours in and of themselves. We reject this idea of royal prerogative. It used to be before the founding change was that kings ruled through divine right. They were placed there by God, and God gave them that position, and therefore it was incumbent upon us to follow them. So we reject the legitimacy of this royal prerogative or the divine right of kings as a legitimate source of right, which had been the tradition up until this point. Now, within this idea of natural rights, legitimate government required the consent of the governed, which we talked about in last week's lecture. So again, the portion of the Constitution, portion of the Declaration of Independence deals with that is right here. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that it should say that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, government are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And that is where we stopped last time, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. In other words, in order for a government to be legitimate, it had to have the consent of the governed. And then Jefferson adds these important words afterwards, which we did not talk about last time, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter, abolish it, and to institute new government. And so that is what they were doing. They were rejecting that royal prerogative, and they were instituting this new form of government, which required the consent of the governed. Now, where did they get these ideas from? In part, they got them from a guy by the name of John Locke. He was one of these political philosophers. We didn't mention him by name last time, but certainly one of the ones that we were referring to. So John Locke, he argued that men are born free in a state of nature, and they possess these natural rights. They are inherent. They are inherent in this state of nature. Again, if you go back to the Declaration of Independence, you look at this. They are endowed by their Creator. Endowed by their Creator. They're God-given. They're God-given is what he's saying. Is what Thomas Jefferson is saying, and that's what John Locke is saying here. They are born free and they possess natural rights. We have them just because we're human. And so then he went on with these natural rights. What people do is they contract among themselves to form a society to protect those rights. The reason they do that is because in a state of nature, it just doesn't work out. State of nature is, it was Hobbes who said, a state of nature is war of all against all. And so it's not a conducive way to live. And then Locke argues that no one could be subject to political authority without his or her consent. So when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he said that he turned to neither book nor pamphlet in writing it. But if you look at the words that he wrote, some of the words, many of the words are identical to the words of John Locke. I believe him. I believe Thomas Jefferson that he turned to neither book nor pamphlet. He had digested the words of Locke. They had become his own. They are what he believed. And so when he wrote from his heart. He wrote those things he knew, and that's what came out. So this foundation of the Declaration of Independence, again, it did not happen overnight. John Locke was one of those. But Locke was closer in time to the Declaration of Independence. He was in the 1600s, late 1600s. There were antecedents of natural rights long before Locke. We want to talk about a few of those to give you an idea that this developed over time. That's how most things happen in society. Most things happen politically over time. There are a few instances in which there's dramatic change. There's a theory called tipping theory, which we'll get to when we get to civil rights. But this is generally how things happen. They happen slowly over time. Let me actually, before we get to this part, though, let me go back and talk about one thing I missed. Some people argue, so here's the part I missed. Let me go back to point number 2 here. Some people argue that it's kind of a stretch to argue that people contract among themselves to form a society to protect their rights. Well, that's certainly what we did at Independence Hall, where the Constitution was written. We said, look, we don't like the government we're living under. We think we can do better, and so that's what we did. I would argue that it doesn't happen all the time, but in fact it does happen. If you look at United Flight 93, this happened on 9/11. On 9/11, when the terrorists took those planes and ran them into the Twin Towers and into the Pentagon, and another flight, United Flight 93, is believed that they were targeting the White House. And when the passengers of United Flight 93 found out from relatives what had happened, they discussed what was going on. They voted as to what they should do, and then they revolted. They revolted from the terrorists who had taken over the plane, and they attempted to take it back. And you've got to give them credit for that. It's just so interesting with this theory that people contract among themselves to form a society. That's exactly what they were doing up there in that plane. The society that they had lived under in the United States had ceased to exist in that plane. It had been taken over by some thugs. They formed a little contract amongst themselves. They voted on it, and then they revolted. It's been said by some that the site of the first victory in the war on terror was right there on United Flight 93 in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where it crashed. So severe was that crash, of course, killing everybody on board, that the flight recorder box, the black box as it's called, was 15 feet down in the ground from the impact of this plane. So there is an example. There's an example right there of people doing exactly what John Locke said. It's natural for us to do in our day. All right, so now let's go back to some of the antecedents of the Declaration of Independence and see what happened there. So in 1215, there is the Magna Carta. And what the Magna Carta does, it in effect says that the king's power is not absolute. So what had happened was King John of England at the time, he approached the lords and he wanted more money to fight some of his wars. And he approached the lords and said, I need more money. And they said, we won't give you more money unless you agree and sign a charter to the effect that we possess certain rights. And King John agreed, and so he signed this Magna Carta. And so here's the king saying, there's certain things I can't do. So the thing that is so critical, so if you're taking notes on this thing, the thing that is so critical about the Magna Carta, and this is a test question, is the fact that it shows that the king's power is not absolute. You need to put that down there, and you need to understand that. This is a major antecedent to natural rights, because at the time, people believed that kings ruled by divine right. And so if God had placed the king there, just like I said, how can you question God's representative? You can't. But here in 1215, 800 years ago, people are beginning to question, quote, God's political representative, that his authority is not absolute. That is a big deal. That is a big deal. All right, next antecedent. And I ask you this question. Hopefully, yes, this question. What is the most important... Supposed to be this one, sorry. What is the most important invention ever created? And if you already saw it from the last slide, I jumped ahead to. It's the printing press. And you might ask yourself, why is the printing press perhaps the most important invention ever created? And it is because it allows for the spread of ideas. Oh, probably 30 years ago, there was an article on this in Time magazine, and you look at the microcomputer today, or the personal computer. Really, what it is a individual printing press. We read most of what we read comes from there. People can post things. It has become a massive, not only printing press, but media outlet that allows for numerous things to happen. Certainly the spread of ideas. And so with the printing press, it used to be that a monk might spend his entire life copying one copy of the Bible. So there just weren't very many to be had. But now with the printing press, it allows for this massive spread of ideas. And this massive spread of ideas, with this massive spread of ideas comes a change in people's reasoning and a change in people's beliefs. And we don't have time to do the next antecedent, but it is Martin Luther, so we'll pick up there with the next video.